Housatonic Valley Association. So I thought it was relevant to start with HVA. So we are the regional watershed organization and land trust that services the whole Housatonic watershed. So that starts up in just north of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and extends south through western Massachusetts, eastern New York, and western Connecticut, all the way to the Long Island Sound. We work to protect the environmental quality of the entire watershed, so all of the lands and waters that drain into the Housatonic River. We do this through two programs, one of which is called the Follow the Forest Initiative, which I'm going to talk more about today. And the other is through our work with Clean, Cold, and Connected, which is to promote and improve our water qualities to be clean, cold, and connected, and to ensure that all of us are connected to those waterways and lands that I mentioned previously. So I'm going to kick us off here with a video. And for those of you on Zoom, you're going to watch it via the television. And I apologize, it won't be the best quality, but I'll make sure you all get the link at some point. And if you visit followtheforest.org, you'll find the video there as well. And this is really going to set the stage for the rest of my presentation. So you're going to have to tell me in the back if you can hear it.
There is a forest, the largest and healthiest of its kind, that seems to go on forever. And like all forests, everything in these woods needs to move. Above the canopy, through the branches, beneath its spreading leaves, even the very smallest creatures. Sometimes over great distances. The very air we breathe, the water we drink, all come from the forest. It sustains us all. But now, because of us, the forest has its limits. We've altered this landscape for our own needs. Animals now find it hard to move where they need to go. Our roads and structures are now barriers that keep wildlife from following the forest as the climate changes. The Follow the Forest initiative is making a difference right now. Working together, we are protecting and connecting our woods for all of us. With space for nature to adapt and thrive across our landscape and beyond. We still have time to make a difference, but we need you. Follow the forest with us today.
Really sets the stage for what we're doing, and I think the young girl that we had narrate the video along with all of that imagery really sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about today, which is the Follow the Forest initiative, which has the goal of protecting and connecting this climate resilient wildlife corridor that starts down where the Appalachian Trail crosses the Hudson River in New York on the Bear Mountain Bridge and extends north through Putnam and Dutchess counties in New York, through the Litchfield Hills of Connecticut, north into the Berkshires, through Vermont, and ultimately all the way to Canada. So it might be a little bit hard to see in the back, but the green on the map is showing core forests. So these are large blocks of forest that you can see extend all throughout this corridor. In addition, on my map, I have the Housatonic watershed, just to sort of place us a little bit, as well as the Appalachian Trail, which forms the backbone for much of this wildlife corridor. And it's a really big goal that we can protect and connect this wildlife corridor, and it's not something that any one of us can do on our own. So it's this idea that really sprang out of the Housatonic Valley Association about 5 years ago when we were working on strategic planning, and now it's a whole lot bigger than us. You can see that it's larger than our watershed, and we do this work in combination with partners, including the Berkshire Environmental Action Team and other partners in Western Massachusetts. And all of our work is informed by science. So much of that science is the science the Nature Conservancy has put together and developed with their resilience and connected landscapes mapping, as well as mapping from the University of Massachusetts. We work together with community scientists. You may also hear citizen scientists, and we choose to use the phrase community scientists to collect local on-the-ground information to really inform this regional vision. None of this is possible without the knowledge of the local individuals. And then we work together to do strategic conservation planning to really understand what it means on the local landscape to carry this vision. Now, as I'm sure most of you in this room know, but I would be remiss if I didn't start my presentation with this, is that forests are a critical piece in the puzzle as we consider the climate crisis. So the map that's up on the screen is showing forests throughout the world. The darker the green, the more of a carbon sink the forest is. And the colors that are more purple mean that the forest is a carbon source, where it's releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And what's really important to note is the forests of the Northeast and of New England really pop out in that dark green as a critical carbon sink, and therefore a critical piece to the climate crisis fight. However, we also know that forest cover in New England is declining. So the graph is showing regional forest cover for all 6 New England states, as well as an overall trend line throughout time. And what you can see, this graph came out of the Wildlands and Woodlands report that was put together by Harvard Forest. And what you can see is that when the colonists came and settled America, they cut down a lot of trees. We all know this. They built houses, they converted land to farmland. And then in the mid to late 1800s, we started to allow that land to return to its natural forested state. And so we had this long time where the forests were recovering and we had an increase in forest cover. But in the late 1900s, we've started to see that forest cover decline again. And if this is one of our critical pieces in the climate crisis fight, we need to do something about our reducing forest cover. Now, I'm also going to assume that most of you in this room are also really passionate about forests, but I have to talk a little bit about the ecosystem services they provide. So hopefully you all can realize that our forests are filtering the water that we drink and the air that we breathe. They're also critical for the surface waters that flow through the Housatonic and all of its tributaries, as well as in the other watersheds throughout our region. They provide critical habitat, which I will continue to talk about throughout my presentation. And they also protect habitat, like the cold water streams that brook trout require, and that are getting less and less common on our landscape, particularly as our climate warms. Now, I've probably used the phrase core forest a number of times here, so I'm going to take a moment to define what that means. So with follow the forest, when we're talking about core forest, we're referring to contiguous interior forest that is over 250 acres in size. So what that means is anywhere that there's a fragmenting feature like a road, houses, or other types of development, we have removed the 300 feet of edge forest and are only accounting for interior forest that's larger than 250 acres in size. 250 acres has been identified as an important threshold for maintaining biodiversity on our landscape. And so that is the threshold we selected. But it's also worth noting that anywhere else in the world, that's considered a pretty small forest block. And it's interesting when you look at our follow the forest mapping, you can see that we really start to lose these as you work your way south, particularly in Fairfield and Westchester counties south of us. So it's really critical that we continue to maintain these on our landscape. The edge forests are removed because they're of different character than the interior. Edge forests tend to experience increased temperatures, higher soil temperatures, as well as drier soils. And if there's roads or other features that create a lot of noise, that noise penetrates into the forest. So there are certain species that require undisturbed interior forest for some or all of their life cycle. And I've thrown some pictures of them up on the screen here. But it's really critical that we maintain that interior forest moving forward to support the suite of biodiversity that need our landscape. Forests and large forests, I feel like are a pretty typical conversation in the conservation world. We've all been working for a long time to protect many of these critical resources, but talking about connectivity requires sort of a different suite of tools. So if we start with why we care about connectivity, the map on the left is showing a generalized map of forest cover throughout the eastern United States. As we can all recognize, the red color that covers much of New England are those maple, beech, and birch forests that we're very familiar with. New England is known for our maple syruping industry. This makes sense with how we all know the landscape. The map in the center of the screen is showing, again, a generalized depiction of how scientists expect our forests to change over time as our climate is warming. And our forests start to shift from many more maple-dominated forests to now oak hickory forests. And while this is a really generalized sort of depiction of our landscape, what's important to note is that species need to move as our climate is changing. They need to be able to shift their ranges to chase those habitat types that they require and to adjust their ranges as the temperature warms. So we need to be able to have that connectivity on our landscape to allow these species to survive. In addition to that, many species need to move throughout the landscape just as part of their regular habitat. We see wildlife all the time in the places that we live, and so we know this to be true. They're moving for shelter and water and food, and as part of their breeding cycle. I'm going to talk a lot more about the amphibians here moving forward. And we too need to be connected to these landscapes and to be able to move from our homes and our communities into the woods and to be able to move throughout the woods. So it's important to recognize that as well. Now I'm going to take a minute to talk a little bit about connectivity. So I have 3 patches of forest here on the screen. We can imagine that these patches of forest are all the same size and of the same configuration. And in between is what we're going to refer to as the matrix, essentially land cover types that are not forested land cover. So you could imagine this to be lawns, fields, farmland, maybe even some houses and roads come into the picture within the matrix. And all of these, depending on what species you're talking about, are changing the makeup of the landscape and shifting how these species can move. So salamanders are a great example to think about connectivity because they have a hard time moving through habitat types like lawns and fields. These are large barriers, particularly when they're large fields or large lawns. The salamanders aren't necessarily going to move through them. So in this current depiction, these are 3 isolated populations of salamanders. This salamander is not able to move to this patch, nor is this one able to move over to the other side. What that means is that there isn't gene flow happening between these patches of salamander populations, and they're more likely to be extirpated or no longer exist within that patch, just given the isolation. There's a lot that we can do within our landscapes to improve the connectivity between these patches. So the first way we can do that is by building stepping stone habitats. So stepping stone habitats are essentially, they're smaller than patches or the core forest that I was talking about, but they're of a similar forest type so that the salamander is able to move from one to the other and spend less time in those fragmenting landscapes that exist. The other option is through corridors, which are linear, contiguous patches of, again, this natural land cover type that's going to allow the salamander to move from one place to another. Oftentimes, these corridors that we talk about are riparian corridors. They already exist along our streams and rivers and are these natural land cover types that sort of naturally exist because they tend not to be places where we build our houses or cause other disturbances. And these are really critical for now allowing these salamander populations to be able to move in and amongst each other. And this is, again, sort of a characterization of a certain species, but you can imagine how this works for the suite of species that we have across our landscape, and even take it a step further to start to think about not just the wildlife, but how plants and seeds and fungi and insects are moving throughout the landscape that we live in. Now, I've talked a lot about the configuration of connectivity, but what's also interesting to think about is how we identify these connections. So Follow the Forest is this big regional vision that spans these 4 states. And if we want to protect and connect this entire corridor, we need to be able to understand where the connections are. This is actually a slightly more challenging task than you may imagine. And so all of this is based, again, in the science from the Nature Conservancy and the University of Massachusetts, where researchers have studied the landscape and identified the areas in general where there's really good connectivity on the landscape. However, at this regional level, we don't have good information on what's happening at the local level. We don't have regional data sets for where fencing may exist or where there are guardrails or other changes on the landscape that are going to shift or funnel wildlife movement. More often than not, these data sets are also, we're getting aerial imagery that is 3 or 4 years old. So it's not always the most up to date, just the way the data sources work. So that's where community scientists and people who know and understand the landscape really come in to inform our regional thinking around connectivity. So with Follow the Forest, we have identified what we refer to as potential wildlife linkages. So you saw this Follow the Forest map a number of times now, and now there's these purple circles, and you can't see the details of the purple circles, and that's okay. But essentially, we've taken this connectivity mapping and we've said, all of these fantastic scientists expect there to be really good connectivity in these areas, but now we need community scientists to go out, walk those roads, and understand what the local conditions are that are influencing wildlife movement. So our goal is to secure at least one linkage between each core forest to say that we have truly secured this wildlife corridor. But in order to do that, we've drawn over 650 purple circles on this map throughout all 4 states. So we have a lot of work to do. And then when that data comes back to us, some of these linkages are going to be across Interstate 84 and Interstate 90 and are going to require a lot of work to know that wildlife are able to actually move. So the tool itself, we've designed to be relatively simple. On the table for those in person, I put some printed out copies of our wildlife linkage assessment tool. I've also put a QR code on the slide for anyone to pull up the digital form. And essentially, we ask for a suite of information to help us understand what you're seeing on the ground. We start with some of the more positive aspects. What types of habitat types are on either side of the road? This is going to give us an idea of what wildlife species may be using this area. We also ask you if you saw any signs of wildlife, or if you travel that area on a regular basis, you can report back to us on the wildlife you see. We ask about whether or not the tree canopy is closed. So essentially the branches on either side of the road are touching or nearly touching and sheeting that road. That facilitates passage for squirrels as well as other critters. We ask really briefly about culverts and bridges, which can provide dry passage for many of these species. And what's really great is we can pair this assessment with a more in-depth assessment of the culverts and bridges to truly understand how they fit into the connectivity picture. The meat of the form is really the barriers to movement. More often than not in our regions, this is traffic. It's the quantity and the speed of traffic on our landscape. And I can't tell you that I have a great solution to that one yet for wildlife. But there's a number of other barriers that exist too that I've named. Fences tend to crop up more than you think. I've been in really rural areas, particularly for Connecticut, and seen fences just 50 feet into the woods in an area where, we thought wildlife movement was going to be great, and all of a sudden it was funneled into this pinch point because there was an 8-foot tall fence that was well maintained and was pushing wildlife to just one crossing point. Jersey barriers, retaining walls, and guardrails can all also shift movement. We then ask volunteers to take all of this data they collected and rank the linkage. So we have a rating scale from excellent to poor, where volunteers select a category and put it into it. They gave us a lot of details on why they selected that rating. And what we found with 155 linkages assessed is this is actually really good data. Even though it's really subjective, the amount of information we collect before you get to that point really helps volunteers to understand what we're looking for and has proven to be a successful rating system. We also ask about the most substantial barriers. So you've gone through and you've ranked all these barriers, but more often than not, there's one or two that really stand out as the most significant barriers. And lastly, we ask for recommendations on ways to improve the linkage. So this might be as simple as saying, it may be a little bit of habitat restoration would be great. Or maybe it's that the culvert or bridge, there's the opportunity to replace that culvert or bridge or to improve passage. We've done this with community scientists of all ages. So the picture on the left is some students who were in middle school who we took out as a group to assess linkages, and it's proven to be a really great tool for engaging them to think about, most of these kids are seeing wildlife in their backyards, but they're not yet thinking about how it connects to the landscape and how we interact with the landscape. And it's proven to be a great tool for that. We've worked together with other environmental organizations, including BEAT, to assess linkages throughout the corridor, and also engaged with volunteers of all types who have come out to really help us with this. And the feedback we get is that it really textures, we all drive around or walk around a lot, and it textures how you think about the landscape. And this was true for me too before I started doing this. Now everywhere I'm going, I'm thinking about the guardrails I'm looking at, the curbs. You're driving along and you're like, wow, how are wildlife moving in this spot? So it really starts to sort of open your eyes to that picture. Within Western Massachusetts, so this map on the left has zoomed in a little bit more to Western Massachusetts. We have 20% of our linkages assessed, largely thanks to BEAT and the great work they have done with that. So the assessed linkages are reflected with the lightly filled in purple, and the ovals that are empty are not yet assessed. Across the corridor, as I mentioned, we have 155 assessed, but I also told you we have more than 650 left. And you might wonder how this falls out across that overall ranking scale that I told you about. The good news is, thus far, almost 2/3 of our linkages are in the good to excellent category. So I consider this to be widely passable for most wildlife who would need it. We still have 1/3 that fall in the fair to poor category. And it's also really worth noting that the poor linkages are the hardest to assess and probably the least likely to be assessed. We have circles on Interstate 90, the Taconics State Parkway, Interstate 84. These are places where I'm not asking volunteers to go walk along those roads. And so it's probably going to be myself and a driver going out, and I'll assess them as we're driving through. So I think the quantity of poor linkages has the likelihood to go up fairly substantially, just given the likelihood of them being assessed. In terms of thinking about this measurement of how secure a linkage is, or how this is this combination of how passable the linkage is, as well as how likely that natural land cover type is to exist on either side of the road. Right now, basically a function of whether or not there's protected land on either side of the road. About 20% of our linkages are considered secure. Again, I expect that number to go down as we assess more of these poor linkages and in areas that we not quite yet. Now is the moment where I like to start to talk about the individual species, because you're probably all sitting there going, well, yeah, connectivity is important, but I see wildlife all the time. I see them moving across roads. What's the relevance? So this picture is a picture of a mama bear and her cubs, and this is actually in Winchester, Connecticut. So northern Connecticut, where traffic was stopped to allow this mama bear to cross the road. I think she had 4 cubs, and they were being rather troublesome as she tried to get them across the road. And even though, I think in Western Massachusetts, you have a pretty large bear population like we do in Connecticut, and even though we see them a lot, roads are actually a stressor for them and cause them to change their behavior. So in one study where they studied the heart rate of bears as well as the movement patterns, they found that mama bears and her cubs, despite this one in the picture, are more likely to shift their behavior, and mama bears display a stress response associated with roads. And more often than not, they choose to cross the roads when we're not on them, so the wee hours of the night, generally speaking. What's also interesting is this is a tactic that's used by a lot of species. They move when the roads are quieter. And they find that when we change our time zone with daylight savings times, that there are more wildlife vehicle collisions because we've changed our behavior and wildlife don't know what our time is and what our schedule is. So that does have an impact. I told you we'd talk more about amphibians, and these are my favorite example of connectivity because they're one of our best examples of a large migration that we have in the east. We don't have the big elk migrations that they have out west or other large movements of animals, but we do with amphibians. So if you don't know, every spring on the first warm, wet nights of spring, so it's like 40 degrees and raining, amphibians will move from their winter breeding or their winter hibernation grounds to their spring breeding grounds. So these are vernal pools that Chelsea talked about earlier. You're having a program about them in a few weeks. But they're seasonal bodies of water that really only exist from like springtime. Often they dry up in August. Sometimes they exist a little bit longer. But they're places where amphibians breed. And more often than not, the winter hibernation grounds and vernal pools are divided by roads. So it's springtime, it's dark, it's wet, and these small critters that are 5 to 7 inches maximum in size are crossing the roads. Luckily, we have a lot of really dedicated volunteers who are passionate about salamanders, and this is true across the whole eastern United States, who go out and help these amphibians to cross the roads to try to reduce some of the amphibian mortality that happens. In the Hudson Valley of New York, they have a really great program collecting data around this. And I'm going to give you 2 snapshots in time. In 2019, volunteers found a little over 3,000 live amphibians across. Big nights are sort of, there's a series of them throughout the spring, there's not just one. And they also found almost 1,500 dead amphibians. In 2020, the big nights happened during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there were still a few volunteers who went out, so the numbers overall were lower because there were less volunteers, but the proportion of dead amphibians was way lower because there were less cars on them. So this is an area where we have the ability to truly have impact because we can identify where the most amphibians are crossing roads, and if we can change our behavior, they stand a better chance of surviving in those road crossings. My last example, we're going to get even smaller, all the way down to the ants that live in the forest floor. So we have this genus of ants that dwell in our forests, and they're really important for dispersing the seeds of some of our favorite spring ephemerals. Bloodroot, trillium, and trout lily, all included in this category. Now, as you all know, ants are really small, so they can only disperse these seeds about 6.5 feet max. That isn't even far enough to make it across a single lane road, let alone a 2-lane. So I don't have a good solution for this one yet, but it's interesting to think about sort of these different categories of how roads are impacting the natural forests on our landscape. We have the bears that are stressed, the amphibians that are largely able to get over them but have a significant mortality, then all the way down to the ants that can't disperse the seeds across these roads. And so there's a lot we can do, right? I just sort of I left you hanging with the ants, that I don't have a good solution, but there's a lot we can do, whether you're an individual who's really excited about the concept or you work for a conservation organization or are engaged. So the picture on the left is an example of really typical America suburbia with our monoculture of lawns. On the right is the idea of what it could be if we started to think about our lawns and backyards as these stepping stone habitats that I talked about earlier. And there's a few things that we can do, even though it can be a little bit intimidating, to start to do that. So the first thing I would talk about, starting to think about particularly native plants and the seasonal food sources that exist in your backyard. And what's great about this is that you can provide seasonal food for wildlife, pollinators, birds, all of the above, and it also increases how interesting your backyard is throughout the whole season. So essentially, this is the idea that you have plants flowering and therefore providing seeds from early spring all the way through to late fall, and you maintain some plants like winterberry or stagcone sumac that are going to hang on to those berries all winter long and feed wildlife throughout. In addition to that, we can increase the amount of cover, or essentially places to hide within our backyards or places we know. This can be through the form of shrubs or other low-hanging vegetation, but it can also be as simple as leaving a pile of brush. That's going to serve as habitat for many different species. And then the last thing to think about is how we manage our habitats. So essentially leaving that habitat. So participating in things like no mow May and waiting to mow your lawn, even though it's tempting to start now, waiting until the end of May when that grass, if you let it grow, is going to provide flowers for pollinators all the way through to when we have more native plants blooming. Leaving the leaves is the idea that we don't need to rake our leaves. They're providing nutrients back to the soil, and they're also providing cover for salamanders and butterflies and moths to hide all winter long. And importantly, even though it's tempting to be outside and cleaning up our yards, leaving them now again through May so that some of these later species that come out later in the year have the cover for as long as they need. In addition to that, we can all have impact around the planning of infrastructure on our landscapes. So I have talked a few times about infrastructure and how it can impact wildlife movement. We sort of briefly talked about culverts, and the Nature Conservancy throughout this area does a lot of really great work around culverts and infrastructure. But in addition to culverts, we can also have some more minor infrastructure projects. So in the top left is an example of a curb that is far better than your average curb that generally sits at a 90-degree angle for salamanders and turtles. So that 90-degree angle curb, salamanders and turtles are not able to climb up it. But if you install your curb at a lower angle, it will still provide its functions and allow for the movement of wildlife. And similarly, the picture in the bottom left is an example of a turtle tunnel, which is a small tunnel installed under the road so that turtles can move underneath instead of over. And in the center is essentially a ditch that was put under the railroad tracks so that salamanders could move through instead of going up and over. You can also participate in a number of community science avenues. I would highly recommend, if you are interested in completing a linkage assessment, that you go ahead and do so. It is likely that there's a circle on the map near your house or near places where you drive. And if there's not, on the digital form, there's a place to add linkages. We have not identified all of the connection points on this landscape, and you all know this area far better than I do, so you're able to add new linkages so that we have the best data available. There's also a number of apps that help us learn about the natural world around us. Seek is one of my favorites for learning about plants and insects that I see, and Merlin Bird ID and eBird are excellent resources for learning all about the birds that you hear and see. None of this would be possible without the great collection of conservation organizations that work throughout this 4-state region. It is this big goal, and not a single one of us could do it alone. So I'm really grateful for the partnership of all of the organizations that work throughout this region, and particularly BEAT for bringing me here this evening and for all of the great work that they've done. So I hope that you all learned a little bit about wildlife connectivity and what it means on our landscape, and that you too will be inspired to complete a linkage assessment or visit followtheforest.org to learn more. And with that, I think I'll open it up for questions.
Housatonic Valley Association seeking conservation restrictions outside of the watershed?
So for those on Zoom, the question was whether or not the Housatonic Valley Association is seeking conservation restrictions outside the watershed. We do hold conservation lands. We tend not to do too much of it. We tend to defer to local partners because there are so many good local partners. And at this point, we don't hold any conservation lands outside of the watershed. I would say unlikely. We're able to think with like planning, thinking big and outside the watershed is totally doable. Once you get to the question of holding land, I think it gets a little bit more complicated. If you have a project in mind, I'd be happy to talk to you because I know a lot of the conservation organizations. Other questions? Yeah.
How big this step into
That's an excellent. Yeah, so the question was, if the core is 250 acre, what size stepping stone habitats or what's the width of a corridor that you need? And I don't think I have a good answer for you in terms of sizing. I would say, generally speaking, bigger is better, right? The linear connected corridor is going to be the best option instead of stepping stones. And ultimately, returning everything to large blocks of intact habitat would be the dream. So sort of the bigger we can get, the better. But I also, we have to think about it from the practical perspective of what can we actually achieve. So if you think about like backyards, they're sort of an easy target because it's also a place where we can all have impact. I would say maintaining grass or lawn in a space that's the space you're going to use, whether it's kids playing or you want to be able to walk a path of grass throughout your yard or whatever it is, keeping that, but then maintaining the rest as some sort of natural habitat. It's sort of less so an exact measurement and more so that practice. Other questions? Yeah. I'm sorry. Let me go back up here and repeat the question. So the question was, what happens when your neighbors don't like your messy yard and report you to towns? I think it's tricky because it's sort of like the question of traffic, right? It all comes down to human behavior and what we're used to. At some point, we were trained as society that these neat lawns are like a status of a nice house. And it's going to be a process to change our behavior. I think maybe some of that could start at the town level. I know some towns in Connecticut participated in No Mow May to various levels of success. They had town greens that they didn't mow until the end of May. So maybe starting to have the conversation and educating. I don't know if there are, so you can get No Mow May signs and other signs, like my Homegrown National Park and Pollinator Pathways also have signs. I don't know if that sort of thing might help convince your neighbor that you're not just like being lazy and not maintaining your yard. There's a reason for this. But I think it's tricky and it's going to be a slow process to convince people that like this is okay. Yeah.
I think
in Pittsfield, there are bylaws saying you can't have grass over 10 inches high. And they aren't too careful about their definition of grass and weeds. And also you can't have a brush.
Yep.
So those two things need to change. And
yeah.
Again,
So for those on Zoom, there's a discussion of towns that have ordinances that your grass can't be over a certain height. And I know that's true, particularly often in the cities in Connecticut. We have a lot of ordinances like that as well. And I think, a lot of it's education. I don't know. I think Pollinator Pathways is a phenomenal ally in all of this because they have done such phenomenal outreach. And maybe starting to gain some traction around pollinator pathways and also helping. Massachusetts has done such phenomenal work around regulating invasive species and not selling invasive species in the nursery trade. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that in this conversation around the importance of native plants and having them in your gardens and really maintaining our landscape because we live, we're one with the natural world. You all know this. It's not us versus them. It's all one space. Are there questions on Zoom?
Yeah, we have one. Do you know if there are Canadian organizations who are doing similar work? Is there room for cross-border collaboration in preserving the corridor?
That is an excellent question. Did you all hear the question? It was whether or not there are Canadian organizations doing similar work and if there's room for cross-border pollination. And I'll start with the answer that our boundary is drawn at Canada because of the way data comes into our mapping software, and most of the data is either produced, you're stuck at the national level, and then ultimately even at state boundaries, we only get certain data. So our mapping stops where it does because of the way the data comes in, which is not to say that the forests stop at the Vermont border. At this point, we haven't pursued partnerships with Canadian organizations because we're sort of, if you think back to the map that had the watershed, the Housatonic watershed on it, we're like slowly working our way north. I would say our partnerships are not as strong in northern Vermont, and we need to develop those before we make it all the way to Canada. And I haven't even thought about conservation in Canada and what it looks like there and how the landscape might be different. So, other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, how do you measure your success? How do you know that it's actually working?
Excellent question. So it's a lot easier to do with core forests. We are able, so we're, in terms of protecting the core forests, we keep track of how much conserved land there is. So we can see over time how the conserved land is growing. And I didn't focus at all on this on my presentation, but we do a lot of strategic conservation planning with organizations to say, what does this look like within your service area? And how does that translate? How does it relate to other needs for land? There's, conservation and forest land are not the only important land uses. So sort of thinking about that balance as well. So measuring protected land within cores, really easy. Measuring success with the linkages is a lot harder, and it's sort of a longer term thing, because when we think about connectivity, particularly within towns and some of the more suburban areas, we're talking about backyards and small parcels that aren't going to be the appropriate lands for a state forest or a state park or something like that. So when we talk about whether or not it's a protected linkage, it's going to be a different measure that I don't have all the answers to that one yet. We've started with sort of this idea of how many secure linkages are there and how many linkages do we have assessed, because that's also the first question is, what does it look like out there? And then what do we need to do? I'd say we also see a lot of success with the number of volunteers and kids and students that we engage. Last year, we engaged over 400 students in learning about connectivity, and I think that in and of itself speaks volume. So a lot of work to do, though.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
How does this correlate with U.S. Forest Service and state agencies in terms of their plan?
That's a great question. The Forest Service, we have not really touched yet. Again, that starts to get more into Vermont where it's more relevant. And they're a whole nother entity to start to understand. Within New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, we work really well with the state agencies. And, it depends a little bit on which department of state agencies you're talking about. But a lot of what we talk about with Follow the Forest aligns with conservation goals of most organizations, right? Like a lot of conservation organizations recognize the importance of forests and to some degree are thinking about connectivity, whether it's connectivity from a habitat perspective or from a trails perspective. So in that way, in some ways, Follow the Forest is just another way of talking about it. It's a way of connecting with someone, anyone, and telling the story. And so we're really able to connect with those state agencies. I will say I've done less of it personally in Massachusetts, so I feel like I can't talk as well about Massachusetts, but really successfully in Connecticut and New York from my work personally.
So we have two people have raised their hands on Zoom. Judy, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask, hopefully we can hear you.
Okay. I'm wondering what kind of impact something like the high road will have on wildlife. It seems like such a wonderful thing, but it's going to increase the traffic up there, and I'm a little nervous about it.
Good. So if anyone is active in here, the question was about the high road, which if I'm not mistaken is about trail connectivity, or is it something else? All in the audience.
Yes, trail connectivity.
Yeah, it's the trail connectivity. Trail. Yeah. And from my perspective, trail connectivity, wildlife connectivity, in many ways it all falls together, right? We're thinking about ways to connect natural spaces together. As you start to get down to a really species specific level, there are some species that are not going to play well with trails. But I think from a sort of a more overall perspective, I think the high road and wildlife connectivity play really well together. And the piece of conservation that is all about getting people outside and to understand why the work we do is important, that work is invaluable because we need people to be out and about and in our forests to understand any of what I talked about today. If you've never been in a forest, you're gonna be like, that's great, but like, I don't know. So that connection piece I think is really critical.
So the question.
Okay.
Instruction.
Excellent question. So the question was, at what level is a road a barrier? Are there thresholds? And generally speaking, I think you answered the question, which is like dirt roads, again, from a general connectivity perspective, assuming they're within a forested landscape, are going to be a relatively small barrier. If it's a dirt road, we're assuming there's relatively low traffic and cars have to move slowly. And more often than not, there's not guardrails. There's maybe there could be fencing, which will channel wildlife movement, but for the most part, you're going to be in a quiet area that's going to be a low barrier. I would say the roads that tend to be the biggest barriers are going to be once you get to like the state Route 7. It's a pretty large barrier for most wildlife, even if some cross it successfully. The sort of gray areas are going to be some of those mid-level roads that aren't quite 7, but also aren't quite your like quiet neighborhood back road. And that is where some more of that landscape context is really going to come into play and understanding even just the local configuration, but also how topography is in the area and where wildlife are going to choose. So it's really one of the reasons we have volunteers out on the ground is because it's so highly dependent on all of those local variables that I can't just look at a map and say, okay, I have information on speed limit, that's good enough, because there's so many other things. Did I have another question in the room? Yeah, I'm gonna come over to you. Excellent question. So the question was about cemeteries and how or if cemeteries fit into the picture. And it's a really good question. And I will go back to the answer of it depends, which is maybe an annoying answer, but it really is the case. Many of them are highly manicured, some are large, some are smaller, and I think, it all comes down to it depends in balance. In isolated areas, that cemetery is not going to have a large impact. It's going to be embedded within the rest of the landscape, and there's going to be a lot else going on that's going to be impacting what wildlife species are there. When they're the really big cemeteries, like I know of one in my town that covers, probably 50 or 100. That's going to be a large feature. If we go back to the salamander, where crossing lawns and fields is really hard for them, that's going to be a huge feature that is insurmountable for them. For other species, like you mentioned, the bear and the deer, it's not going to be as big of a deal. And for other species, it sort of falls in between. One of the ones I didn't talk about, but that's another great example, is the fisher, which it looks like a weasel. And they thrive on large, intact, forested habitats. So we have a researcher in Connecticut who's been trying to study where fisher are in the state of Connecticut. And she put out cameras along with bait all throughout the state, and she didn't capture a single picture of a fisher. I know of another researcher who is in southern New York who's been researching fisher. And the spot where he is surrounded by interstates, and it's a 3,000-acre forest, and within that forest, they have no fisher. On the other side of Interstate 87, though, in a similar forest block, they have. So as we start to think about picky species like the salamander and the fisher, more of those things are going to matter, and the fisher might not move to the golf course, or not the golf course, the lawn cemetery either. But I sort of put all of those right in the same category of like, they're natural, or not natural, but they're not paved surfaces, but they're still fragmenting for some of these species. Zoom?
Yeah, so says clients are concerned about letting tall grasses grow, often because of ticks. Just a concern about ticks comes up when she suggests reducing lawns and creating a crossing.
Yeah. So if anyone in the back didn't hear, the question is about taller grass and ticks, and the concern that if you let your grass grow, there will be more ticks. And I would say no matter what, the ticks are there. The lawns or letting taller grass grow is not going to increase the population of ticks. more often than not, you hear people who talk on this subject to recommend really keeping those areas where you, your kids, your dog are going to be shorter grasses and then letting other things grow. So you're more likely, right? Japanese barberry is an invasive plant that has the perfect ecosystems for ticks. You're more likely to find ticks on Japanese barberry than practically any other plant. So I don't recommend going bushwhacking through barberry, and I wouldn't recommend it being right next to the spaces where you're trying to recreate. And so maintaining those so that you can feel safe, your clients can feel safe, but allowing the other spaces where you spend less time to be more natural, I think is sort of the best approach, coming down to sort of that balance. Other questions? Yes.
Also on the ticks, is there anything that you can do in like landscape or encourage things like possums and other things like the ticks to come and join you?
It's a good question. I don't know. I know that I have a possum that likes when I don't clean my grill well. So it could be one way. But that's a really good question. Yeah, compost pile like that too. Yeah. Yeah.
Ticks like possums and possums like ticks.
There you go. So chickens and guinea hens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also a mixture of rosemary and thyme.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are planting thyme plants. And that becomes ticks as well.
Yeah. So for those on Zoom, we're talking about herbs like rosemary, thyme, and mint. Like that. For repelling ticks as ways, and having thyme in your lawn as a way to repel them. I also heard that helps around like blueberry bushes and other things to help keep at least critters that crawl away from your berry bushes. I haven't tried it yet, but I've heard that rumor.
And using
Thyme all around your berry bushes. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about invasive plant control and early successional habitat. Invasive plants are like could deserve a whole nother at least hour-long talk. My favorite example of ways to think about invasive plants actually comes out with New York State. So they think about invasive plants using partnerships for regional invasive species management. And through that program, they've designated 5 areas throughout the state. And they keep track of all of the invasive plants within the state and put them into categories. So they have tier 1 through tier 5. And essentially tier 1 is like those rapid response species that don't yet exist within that region. And tier 5 are gonna be those that are well habituated, like barberry, multiflora rose, garlic mustard, all of the things we all see. And so the idea is that unless you're talking about a special habitat that has a rare species, the fight against any of those tier 5 species, any of the ones we see on a regular basis, is going to be so hard. The seed source is already dispersed throughout our seed, that it's better to channel the energy to those that don't yet exist throughout the whole landscape. So targeting the new ones before they get really established. And the other piece I'd add, which I alluded to, is like, if you're managing an area for something in particular, a really sensitive species, bog turtles are an excellent example of an endangered species that has really specific habitat requirements, then you might think harder about managing some of those invasive plants. And if you're in your own yards, thinking about the barberry and ticks, you know, I might try to manage some of the barberries, but in many ways, it's such an exhausting activity that channeling your energy, I'm maybe a little bit of a pessimist on invasive plants. I don't think we're going to get rid of most of them. So channeling your energy in those really targeted fashion would be my advice. But you ask 3 different people and they'll tell you 3 different things. What are you thinking about early successional habitat?
Particularly for species that are down.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those on Zoom, the question about early successional habitat directly relates to cottontail and migratory birds. And for anyone who doesn't know, early successional habitats are like those thick, shrubby areas. So as an area, if it was cleared of forest, it'll have a lot of dense plants within it. That's early successional habitat. Or if you leave like a field fallow for many years, it'll revert to that as well. And I think it's a tricky question because there's a lot of important species that rely on it, but I don't think that the answer is cutting down core forests in order to do so. So it sort of comes back to being, unless that's a spot where like there's a documented until then maybe there's a good reason, but being really thoughtful because we know how important forests are for the fight against climate change. Being really thoughtful about how we do management within our landscape, I think is really cool. So putting those in important places and making it part of sort of the overall matrix and habitat. That would be my personal take. We tend to stay away from it. It's a tricky topic. Yeah.
And your focus is north and south.
Yeah.
South is more important for wildlife versus east and west.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the question was about sort of the north-south directionality as opposed to east-west. So we had to draw our boundaries somewhere, and so we selected the Connecticut River and the Hudson River as our boundaries. And particularly as you work your way downstream on those rivers, it makes a lot of sense. We don't get the ice cover that we used to, and so in many ways, particularly the Hudson, with how tidal it can be and how large, it serves as some sort of barrier for some species. There is absolutely east-west movement, and within the corridor itself, I often think a lot about that east-west movement. But it's not to say that there's not important forests on, right, connecting to the Quabbin is important, connecting up through the White Mountains into the high peaks of Maine is also important, but it's sort of we have to draw our boundaries somewhere. I could imagine Follow the Forest having east and west components someday as well. Yeah.
Any other questions? Right. Oh, awesome. I think we'll end it then.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.